But here's the real question. What if the kid knows more than the professor? The heavy wooden door to lab room 407 creaked open at 8:01 a.m., a minute after class began. Heads turned. Silence swept through the room like a wave. He was small, barely 5 feet tall, wearing oversized coveralls that swallowed his frame and sneakers with holes near the toe. But his eyes, those dark, thoughtful eyes, scanned the room with the caution of someone who knew he wasn't welcome. His name was Micah Ford, only 12 years old. And this wasn't a middle school science lab. This was a graduate-level mechanical engineering course at Oak Ridge Technical Institute, one of the top-ranked engineering programs on the East Coast. And standing at the front of the room, mid-lecture with a marker in her hand and disdain in her stare, was Dr. Clarissa Vale, a professor known less for her warmth and more for her ruthless standards. "Excuse me?" Her voice cut like a blade across the room. "Did someone lose their little brother this morning?" A few students chuckled. One muttered under his breath, "Must be the janitor's kid." Micah took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm Micah Ford. I'm registered for this course." The tension in the room thickened. Dr. Vale arched an eyebrow. "This is an advanced thermodynamics lab focused on engine dynamics and system failures," she said coldly, walking toward him in her sharp heels. "You're in the wrong place. Your elementary school is 4 blocks down." Micah didn't flinch. He simply reached into his frayed backpack and pulled out a folded letter, hands steady. "My placement letter," he said, handing it over. Dr. Vale read it. Slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was real. He was here through Oak Ridge's Future Innovators program, a rare full scholarship designed for exceptionally gifted students under the age of 16. It was something the department only offered once every few years. And clearly, Dr. Vale hadn't been informed. "Well," she said with a clipped tone, "I suppose we're testing the limits of what diversity really means these days." That line stung. Even from the back of the room, you could feel it. The weight of judgment, the silent assumption that he didn't belong, not because of his intellect, but because of the color of his skin and his age. Micah nodded. "Where should I sit?" "Find a corner, Doctor," Vale said with a wave of her hand. "Try not to fall asleep." As he made his way toward an open stool near the lab equipment, some students glanced at him with curiosity, others with amusement. But one girl, tall, freckled, red curls bouncing as she leaned over, whispered, "Don't let her get to you. She's like this with everyone." Her name was Leah Simmons, and in the sea of skepticism, she was the first lifeline. Dr. Vale returned to the whiteboard, her movements sharp and precise. She resumed her lecture on combustion engine cycles, fuel efficiency, pressure thresholds, mathematical models, entropy loss. Micah opened his notebook. Not a tablet, not a laptop, just an old, well-used composition notebook with hand-sketched schematics, oil-stained pages, and notes in the margins that were far beyond what most college sophomores would understand. And here's something I personally believe. The size of a person has nothing to do with the scale of their mind. You ever meet someone who just sees the world differently, who listens instead of talks, who notices the things nobody else does? That was Micah. He didn't just learn engines, he lived them. Micah's uncle, Raymond Ford, was a master mechanic in Southside Atlanta. He ran an old-school garage where nothing was computerized, but everything got fixed. From age 6, Micah was disassembling carburetors. By 8, he could rebuild a transmission blindfolded. By 10, he was designing mods for dirt track cars. So when Dr. Vale pointed to the whiteboard and asked the class, "What is the primary limitation of the auto cycle?" Micah's hand rose before anyone else's. She narrowed her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Ford." "Knock," he said confidently. "The pre-ignition of the fuel-air mix. When cylinder compression is too high, it causes spontaneous combustion before the spark plug fires. That can destroy pistons." The room froze. Dr. Vale blinked. "Correct," she said, her tone tinged with annoyance. "And where did you learn that?" Micah shrugged. "Same place most people do." Blown head gaskets. Some students laughed, not mockingly, but because they recognized the guts it took to say something like that, and because he wasn't wrong. But not everyone was impressed. A senior named Trent Weston, varsity crew captain with a smug smile and an overinflated sense of self, muttered, "Cool story. Wait till he tries something harder than spark plugs." And Dr. Vale? She wasn't done putting him in his place. "Since you seem to know so much," she said suddenly, turning toward the back of the room, "why don't you demonstrate it?" She gestured to the corner of the lab, toward a metal beast that sat silent and cold under a plastic cover. It was the department's pride, an experimental four-cylinder engine prototype with a persistent mechanical issue that had stumped doctoral candidates for 6 months. The engine was frozen, would seize mid-test every time they ran it. Nobody could figure out why. "You have 10 minutes, Mr. Ford," Dr. Vale said, lips curling. "If it's so easy, show us." Micah blinked, unsure if she was serious. "Oh, I'm very serious," she added. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to go back to middle school." Now here's where most kids, heck, even most adults, would have panicked. But not Micah. He walked slowly to the engine, removed the cover, and knelt down like a musician greeting his instrument. Silence. Tick, tick, tick. The stopwatch began. He said nothing, just stared at the machine, touched nothing, moved around it like he was listening. And here's what most of the class didn't get in that moment, but Leah did. And I did too, as the narrator of this story. You don't need to rush to prove brilliance. Brilliance often begins in silence. Over the next few minutes, murmurs spread through the room. "He's not doing anything," Trent sneered. "Just sniffing the engine?" Leah shot him a glare. "He's observing." "Let him work." Dr. Vale, arms crossed, was smirking. But Micah? He wasn't performing. He wasn't stalling. He was processing. He asked no questions, didn't use a laptop, didn't check schematics. Instead, he reached for a single tool, a flashlight. Then, with surprising precision, he removed the oil filter housing, took a sample, held it to the light, and sniffed the fluid. Finally, he stood. "I need to see the maintenance records," he said. Dr. Vale chuckled. "Excuse me?" "There's evidence of thermal degradation," Micah said calmly. "The oil's foaming. You've got cavitation in your pump. I'm guessing you used synthetic blend, but didn't factor in thermal expansion tolerances. Your internal clearances are too tight." The room exploded into whispers. Dr. Vale's expression turned to stone. "That's enough," she snapped. Micah didn't flinch. "It's why it seizes during warm-up. Not a flaw in the engine design, a flaw in your assumptions, and just like that, everything shifted. Let me ask you this. What happens when a kid walks into a room full of experts and makes them all question what they thought they knew?" The room was no longer whispering. It was buzzing. Whispers had turned into stunned silence. The sharp scent of synthetic oil still hung in the air. All eyes were locked on one boy, Micah Ford, who had just calmly diagnosed a months-long engine failure in under 5 minutes, without ever turning a bolt. Dr. Clarissa Vale's smile was gone. Gone was her smirk. Gone was her sarcasm. In its place stood something colder, disbelief, in the slow-burning humiliation of a professor whose trap had just backfired in front of her entire class. "I believe," she said slowly, "that you were given 10 minutes. You still have 5. Care to implement your theory?" Micah didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am." And just like that, he got to work. While the class watched, most assumed this would be the part where he would slip up. You know the drill. Bright kid throws out a flashy theory, but falls apart when it's time to deliver. But not Micah. He moved like a surgeon, deliberate, confident, respectful of the machine. He didn't attack the engine. He worked with it, like he was listening for its permission. Every bolt he turned, every panel he removed, felt practiced, natural. He was in his element. And then he did something that made half the class gasp. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small bottle. It was dark, unlabeled, except for a handwritten tag that read, MOS 2-4% blend. Dr. Vale raised her voice, trying to stay in control. "What exactly are you adding to my lab equipment, Mr. Ford?" "It's molybdenum disulfide," Micah replied calmly. "An additive. Not permanent, just enough to increase clearance temporarily, reduce friction, and prove the diagnosis. You're tampering with a precision instrument. No, Professor, he said respectfully. I'm solving your problem. The room had gone silent again. Students who had doubted him were now slowly gathering around, peering over shoulders, drawn by curiosity, and something more powerful. Respect. And here's what I believe as the storyteller here. Respect isn't something you get from a title. It's something you earn when your work speaks for itself. Micah closed the engine panels, checked each connection, recalibrated the sensor inputs by hand. Then with 2 minutes left on the timer, he pressed the ignition button, and the engine, long thought dead, came to life. Smooth, silent, perfect. It didn't rumble. It purred. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then someone whispered, "No way." The engine had never run like this. Not once. Professor Vale stared at the machine, her arms at her sides, face pale. She checked the monitor. Oil pressure, normal. Combustion chamber temps, optimal. No cavitation. No power surges. No early knock. The impossible engine was alive. I've calibrated for a 0.002-inch increase in clearance using the additive, Micah said, speaking like someone twice his age. You'll want to remachine the pump long term, but this'll run for hours. Then he took a step back, hands still stained with oil, face calm. I'm done. No one clapped. Not yet. They were too stunned. One student leaned over to Leah. Did he really just... Yes, she whispered. He did. Then the silence broke. First it was one person, then another. Clapping. Applause built like thunder. Even Jake, the smug senior who had mocked Micah earlier, was on his feet, nodding. He's legit, he said half to himself. That wasn't a fluke. But not everyone was cheering. Dr. Vale hadn't moved. Her pride, her plan, her performance. They'd all just been disassembled in front of the entire class. A kid, a black kid from a working-class neighborhood, wearing a name stitched into an old coverall, had done what none of her students could do in 6 months. And she had handed him the stage herself. Congratulations, she said finally, her voice low, almost robotic. You've proved your point. Micah didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply said, I didn't come here to prove a point. I came to learn. That line landed harder than any insult. Because here's the thing about people like Micah. They don't need to humiliate you. Their excellence does it for them. After class, as the students filed out, buzzing, energized, and suddenly questioning everything they thought they knew, Micah stayed behind. He was cleaning the tools he'd used, wiping down the engine like it was sacred. That's when Dr. Vale spoke again, this time softer. Where did you learn all that? Micah looked up. My uncle, he said. He runs a shop back home. Taught me to fix what other people give up on. Did he also teach you how to recite thermal expansion coefficients from memory? Micah smiled gently. That part came from MIT's OpenCourseWare. I've been taking college courses online since I was 10. Dr. Vale looked away. A long pause stretched between them. Then she said something nobody expected. Would you consider being my teaching assistant? Micah blinked. Ma'am, you clearly have insights this program is missing. I'd like to learn from you. He stood still, stunned. I'm just a kid, he said finally. No, she said. You're an engineer. How far can one act of brilliance go when it's seen by the right people at the right time? The day after Micah Ford brought the impossible engine back to life, Oak Ridge Technical Institute was buzzing like never before. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Faculty members whispered about the prodigy in coveralls. Grad students who'd never set foot in lab room 407 were now lingering around the door hoping to catch a glimpse. And professors from other departments, yes, even the robotics and aerospace faculty, were emailing Dr. Clarissa Vale asking one question. Was it real? Her reply was simple. Come see for yourself. Micah arrived that morning in the same worn hoodie and scuffed sneakers. No entourage, no press, just his backpack, his notebook, and a calm focus that had become his trademark. But the moment he walked in, the energy shifted. The lab was already half full, Students and faculty leaning on benches, sipping coffee, pretending not to stare. Dr. Vale greeted him differently this time. No condescension, no challenge. Just, "Good morning, mister." Ford Micah smiled shyly. "Morning, professor." And as if that small exchange had given the room permission, the clapping started again. Soft at first, then louder, more sincere. Not just awe, but respect. It wasn't just the engine he had fixed. It was something bigger. Micah had cracked open the very culture of the place. That morning, instead of her usual lecture, Dr. Vale stood before the class and made a quiet announcement. "We're changing the curriculum." Murmurs. She nodded toward Micah, who looked down at his notebook, trying not to shrink into his seat. "I realized yesterday," she said, "that we've been training people to think like machines, to value simulations over senses, equations over experience. But engineering is about solving real problems in the real world. And real problems don't wait for perfect conditions." She paused. "So, starting next week, this class will include weekly diagnostic labs, real engines, real issues, and Mr. Ford will be assisting me in designing those sessions." Silence again. Then Leah stood up and clapped. Others followed, and Micah. He just stared at the floor, blinking fast, his hands shaking a little. That day changed everything. By the end of the week, the Dean of Engineering himself had visited Lab Room 407. He watched as Micah led a small group of grad students through a sample diagnostic process using nothing more than his notebook and a whiteboard. He explained oil film breakdown, showed how thermal mapping was often misleading, demonstrated how smell, texture, and vibration gave insights no sensor could replicate. And the dean? He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Dr. Vale and said, "He's not just a student, he's a methodology." Meanwhile, the students were transforming. Trent, the cocky senior who had mocked Micah on day one, now asked if he could shadow him during lab. Emma, the shy transfer student, admitted she had always been scared of hands-on work, but now found herself elbow-deep in a disassembled fuel injector, grinning. And Jake? He apologized. Twice. "I didn't see you, man," he admitted. "All I saw was your age, your shoes, your skin. But what you did, it made me question everything I thought I knew about who's supposed to be smart." Micah didn't gloat. He just said, "Thanks. That means a lot." Now let me tell you something personal here, as someone who's watched too many people get passed over for how they look rather than what they know. What happened next was justice, and it was overdue. 2 weeks after the engine incident, the engineering department held its annual faculty symposium, usually a dry, invite-only event with research presentations and dull speeches. But this year, Micah Ford was on the keynote list. Dr. Vale introduced him. Not as a child genius, not as a diversity story, but as the engineer who made us all rethink how we teach, how we learn, and how we solve. Micah stood at the podium, his voice shaking a little, but his words clear. "When I fixed that engine, I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. I was trying to understand why something wasn't working, and I used everything I had: books, videos, Uncle Ray's advice, gut instincts, and trial and error. But most importantly, I didn't assume I already knew the answer. I just listened." That last part hit hard, because how often do we forget to listen to the data, to each other, to ourselves? After the speech, something unexpected happened. The dean offered Micah a position, a custom-designed accelerated track, blending undergrad and graduate study with full mentorship, lab access, and even a research stipend. And not only that, he approved Micah's request for his uncle, Raymond Ford, the mechanic from Southside Atlanta, to come teach a guest lecture series on real-world diagnostics. Dr. Vale said it best in her email to the faculty. "We've spent years teaching theory without touching grease. It's time we invite the grease in." By now you might be wondering, what did this moment mean? A 12-year-old fixed an engine. Great. But here's what it really meant. That students stopped being afraid to ask dumb questions. That professors started respecting experience, even if it came without a degree. That the invisible lines between theory and practice, between elite and outsider, started to blur. Micah didn't just fix a machine, he rewired a system. But this chapter wasn't about just proving he belonged. It was about what happened when others realized they needed to change too. And isn't that the real miracle? Not that Micah was brilliant, but that an institution finally listened to brilliance that didn't wear a lab coat or speak with credentials. They listened to a boy with a backpack, an oil-stained notebook, and a mind wide open. And because they did, everything changed. If a 12-year-old can walk into a room full of adults and change everything, what's stopping the rest of us from listening to the people we overlook every day? Weeks passed, but at Oak Ridge Tech, it felt like a new era. Micah Ford wasn't just that kid who fixed the impossible engine anymore. He was Micah Ford, co-instructor. And when he entered Lab 407, people stood a little straighter, listened a little closer. But here's where things got interesting. Micah never once acted like he was better than anyone. Instead, he kept doing what he'd done since day one, listening, observing, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. Questions like, why don't we teach this method in all your labs? Why aren't students allowed to try hands-on solutions first? Why is there only one black professor in the entire engineering department? That last one, that shook the room. And it needed to. Because while everyone was celebrating Micah's genius, few were ready to confront what his presence revealed. That the system wasn't just outdated, it was rigged. Built to elevate the privileged, ignore the practical, and shame those who learned differently. When Uncle Raymond Ford finally stepped into the lecture hall, his coveralls crisp, his hands calloused, he didn't come to prove anything. He came to teach. And the moment he started speaking, you could feel it. This engine doesn't care what your GPA is, he said, pointing to a disassembled block on the table. It doesn't care if your daddy's rich. It just wants someone who understands it, who respects it, who listens. He showed students how to diagnose by feel, how to interpret sounds no sensor could catch, how to understand failure not as shame, but as data. And for the first time, students saw wisdom that wasn't born in a textbook, but in struggle. Dr. Vale stood in the back the entire time, silent, and afterwards she approached Uncle Ray and said something simple, but seismic. You've taught them more in 90 minutes than I've taught in a year. And that might have been the end of it. A neat, tidy story about a gifted kid and his uncle who changed the school. But the truth, it didn't end there. Because the story made it online. A student uploaded footage of Micah diagnosing the engine. Calm, clear, precise. The video blew up. 1 million views in 24 hours, then 10 million, then national news. 12-year-old prodigy silences skeptics with engine diagnosis that baffled PhDs. Suddenly, major universities were calling, STEM foundations, policymakers. Micah's face appeared on the cover of Scientific Weekly next to the headline, "The Boy Who Taught Us to Listen." But while everyone focused on Micah's genius, he made sure the conversation never strayed from what really mattered. I'm not special because I'm young, or black, or smart. I'm special because someone gave me a chance. Imagine how many kids like me never even get that far. Then came the moment that left the entire nation in awe and made some people furious. Micah was invited to speak at the National Engineering Summit in Washington, D.C., room full of executives, professors, lawmakers, billionaires. And Micah stood there, all 5 feet of him, behind a massive podium, and said, "This isn't a success story. It's a warning, because I shouldn't be the exception. I should be the rule. But there are thousands of other kids, smart, curious, brave, who never get into rooms like this. Not because they're not good enough, but because nobody ever bothered to ask what they know." He paused. Let it sink in. Then, "You think I'm brilliant? Then do something brilliant. Change the rules," that speech. It sparked a national program, the Ford Fellowship Initiative, a scholarship named after Micah, backed by the Department of Education, that partners elite engineering schools with local auto shops, community centers, and underfunded schools to find and nurture talent in overlooked communities. And Uncle Ray? He was appointed Director of Practical Diagnostics for Oak Ridge. Now let me say this plainly. Micah Ford fixed more than an engine. He fixed the lie that genius always wears a lab coat. He fixed the lie that age, wealth, or skin color define who belongs in the room. And most importantly, he gave us all a mirror and asked if we liked what we saw. So, if you ever find yourself in a room full of people who doubt you, remember the boy who stood tall in oil-stained clothes and silenced a university with nothing but truth. If you ever catch yourself judging someone by their appearance, remember the professor who had to be humbled before she could grow. And if you ever wonder if one voice, your voice, can change anything, remember this story, because the world didn't change because Micah shouted. It changed because he was heard. The engine still sits in Lab 407, clean, untouched. But it's no longer just a machine. It's a symbol, a reminder that the most powerful tool in engineering, or in life, isn't a wrench or a formula. It's the willingness to listen, to learn, and to believe that brilliance can come from anywhere, even a 12-year-old boy from the south side of Atlanta.